My name is Carl Quill, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Jeanne-Marie Owens has a pretty unique founder's journey. She was employee number 1 at Phoenix Labs after a career at EA and BioWare, and got to see the founding journey as that team went through multiple fundraising rounds, scaled, released a game, Dauntless, and were acquired. She then chose to go back on that journey again, this time as a full founder from the start. This process of choosing to found again is always really interesting to me. What lessons do folks take forward and apply to the next one? How do they do that? And in this case, Jen had a pretty structured approach, which I would expect nothing less from her. We also talk about DigiBC, a local organization whom she is the current executive chair of the gaming side, and the role that these kinds of orgs provide to founders and the industry. I got to work with Jen at Phoenix Labs, and she is one of my favorite people. I'm excited for y'all to meet her. Let's jump in.
So today I am getting to sit down with one of my favorite people, and this is going to be a very funny interview because I think we will spend most of the time cracking each other up and trying to be serious. But you have a really fascinating founder journey because technically speaking, with this latest journey, it is your first time as a founder, but you were also basically there from the very beginning of Phoenix Labs and saw that entire founding journey play out. And so sort of two things that I'd love to understand is what were your big takeaways and how did you sort of process that sort of being in the front row seat of a founding journey? And then what led you to say, no, I want to do that again, this time as a founder?
Yeah, I sometimes think of myself as like the 1.5 times founder.
Yeah.
I definitely feel like a second time founder most of the time. I get treated like a second time founder in almost every instance. But to your point, technically, I'm not. When I started the Phoenix Labs journey, I was the first employee after the founders. And at the time that I chose to join that startup, I was at a point in my life that was very like safe to take risks and safe to fail. And I was like, most startup fails. This probably is going to only last a year or two. And then I'll just go back to my job at EA and it'll be a fun little journey that I get to tell stories about later. And so I went into it with a very like, open to it being great, but also open to it being a failure. And I think that meant that I had a really flexible approach to the journey and we kind of just kept rolling with all the punches. And, 9 years and venture scaling and 350 employees in 4 studios and selling the company twice during a pandemic. It was a hell of a journey. I was correct. It was just not quite what I was expecting. But I did feel like part of the founding team from day one. I always was involved in the business side of the business. I always was part of the conversations about what our strategies were and where we were going. And I felt deeply responsible for people's payroll, which I think is like the uniting factor of all founders is they always come back to like, I have to make sure people make payroll. And I felt that from day one. So I always felt that founder weight as well. Although, maybe I felt it differently than the other 3 did. So it's interesting now going through this a second time because there's so much of it that's more straightforward and knowable and understandable. And, the company setup took 3 weeks instead of 3 months, and that's been great to be able to sort of move really quickly through problems because we have this experience. But it's also it's both the same journey and a very different journey at the same time.
Mhm.
The emotional weight feels different in ways that I didn't expect it to. I thought I knew what it would feel like, and it still feels different somehow.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I was curious because I think, having so many of the shortcuts and, to your point, feeling the ticking clock of payroll, I think is absolutely a core part of a founding journey. And I think part of what I'm curious about, right, like, is having gone through all of that, it like a really wild journey for Phoenix Labs, right? Like with the ups and the downs, and like, you guys had I was there for part of it. Um, you had the successful exit with Garena, and then you lived into those sort of big subsidiary company dreams, and then you ended up selling again in the middle of a huge economic downturn, and like all sorts of the ways that you sort of had both the good and the bad, or not even the bad, but good and rougher exits.
oh, no, there was
um,
definitely bad. It's not
yeah,
the
yeah,
exit itself, but there was definitely bad.
sure. And so I'm curious, was there something that you felt unfinished, or are you now like a serial entrepreneur, as they say in the circles? What drove you to be like, no, 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 like let's get in the trenches again?
Yeah, I mean, so transparently coming out of Phoenix, I was pretty done with video games. The ending of the journey was a lot bumpier than the beginning of the journey,
Mhm.
and while I think we left it in the best hands that we could at the time, and I think that the teams were working on really cool projects, and I loved the people that I worked with, it was still really challenging to go through that second sale, to your point, in maybe the worst quarter that you could have ever tried to sell a video game company, in Q3 of 2023. It was a brutal sale process. It was a tough leadership transition, and it had been 9 years, and the last 18 months of it had been sort of like existential threat every day to the company.
Mhm.
And that was really hard, and I was super burned out. And as I came out of Phoenix in the fall of oh, so no, I guess we sold the company in the Q3 of 2022. When I came out of Phoenix in the fall of 2023, I felt very done with games. I didn't really think I wanted to work in the industry anymore. I kind of wanted to go back to working at a bookstore quietly, where no one would talk to me for a while. And I wasn't really sure whether I was gonna stay in the industry or not. And my co-founder, my business partner, Jesse, kind of felt the same. We were both really burned out when we left, and he decided he was gonna, semi-retire, do some consulting, work on cars, you know, while he thought about what he wanted to do. And I didn't think that starting another game studio was what was gonna be next.
Mhm.
Um, but we both got bored really fast. And we also went through this process that I think was really important and really healthy for us of sitting down and doing like a really classic agile retrospective postmortem of the Phoenix Labs journey. Um, which was a huge amount of time. We spent the better part of 3 weeks on it with our other former co-founder Sean, and we sat in a room and we broke the company journey up into phases of
Mhm.
the fundraising phase and the initial team and building the first concepts, and we went through every phase of the company, and then we wrote down all of the major events that had happened in that phase and just historical facts, what had happened. And then after we'd sort of laid out this giant timeline of the last 9 years, we went back and went through the actual, hey, what had been good about those periods, what had been challenging, what did we learn from them, what would we have done differently. And it was that what would we have done differently that started to sort of like pick at my brain, or was like, man, now that I know X, I sure wish I could have done Y. And those, like, just enough of those little things started needling away in my brain. If I could do it again, I would, fill in the blank. And Jesse felt like he had more games in him to direct. And so after we talked a lot about it, we realized that, We did have the privilege to be in a position that we could start a new company. We felt like we could commit to startup life again, and we were excited to try a bunch of different things this time. So we decided we would start the journey over, which may be a crazy choice, but here we are.
But here you are. So you jump on this again. You have just gone through an exercise where, like, not only did you have the experience of going through the Phoenix Lab journey, but I think, the really remarkable opportunity to sit there with previous co-founders and talk through explicitly, like, here in detail, what it was, that journey, what did we learn, what would we do differently, and all these kinds of things. And then you jump into this new one. Has there been any moments now where in this new path you've been like, oh, I thought I had everything figured out, I thought I had it all mapped out, I thought I had learned everything, but oh nope, here's this new thing that sort of come out of the field for this new journey that now I've had to learn, that stands out to you?
I mean, there are some really like boring operational things that I'm not sure are exactly the most exciting stories for the people who are listening. Um, it's fun to sort of blaze through problems that you really understand, like setting up payroll and getting your chart of accounts all set up in QuickBooks and understanding what your month end process is. And setting up a benefits program this time was 2 phone calls and a week, and not months of trying to understand how the insurance companies work. But then I feel like in the very, like, life finds a way, uh, monkey paw, new things are problems, you know? We ended up we ended up building our studio inside an old mechanics warehouse in an industrial part of the city, and getting renovations to be able to use it for game development has been a whole journey that I did not expect. We've done a lot of renovations projects in previous studios, but this one's been particularly more complicated. And, something that sounds trivial, like getting a business license, has been very difficult. So there have been all of these moments where, like, I've done this before, but here's a new version of the problem for sure. One of the things that's been interesting, and Jesse and I have talked a lot about, is that even when there's big problems or a challenge that we weren't expecting, it feels easier to handle right now because it's our choice on how to proceed. One of the interesting challenges in reflection on the Phoenix journey was we had so many years of independence, and then we were part of a public company. And being part of a public company comes with an incredible layer of pressure and reporting. And they were a phenomenal parent company. And I would say, like, 9 out of 10 acquisitions, or like a 9 out of 10 result in acquisitions. I think we got so lucky. We had a great parent company. We had a wonderful relationship with them, and it was still being part of a public company, which was very restrictive in what we could do, very restrictive in what we could say, and very challenging. And so, having come through that period of the journey into this again, it almost feels like, yes, there are problems, but now they're our problems again. And we get to decide how to approach them. And that's been very liberating, is not the right word, but comforting, I guess. It just doesn't feel so bad because at least I can do something about it.
Yeah, I think that is one of the that is the silver lining on every problem with a startup journey is, well, it's your problem. You get to decide how you want to deal with it. But to your
It's
point,
your problem, but also it's your problem.
yeah, exactly. And to your point, I think, I remember with Ghostly Bear of like, oh, it is my problem. Whereas like when I was in Riot as an employee, right? Like not so much the part of the public company, but as an employee, right? Like there was the way you did things within that structure and you couldn't solve it exactly how you wanted. And then at Ghostly Bear, it was that freedom and suddenly that responsibility and the like, monkey's paw of like, it's your problem, congrats, right?
Yeah, and
So
I kind of get why people become serial entrepreneurs just on that aspect. I
yeah,
think that if you are a person who responds well to you have the freedom to solve this problem, and then you've been given the opportunity to flex that muscle for a really long time, going back into a really strict set of processes or a really strict hierarchy or having to sort of like step back and say, well, that's the way we do it. I think you have to be in a particular mindset to be able to go back into that. And
yep,
I really did think I was probably more likely to do that. I was ready to just be like, you know what? It's not my problem. Somebody else can deal with this. Um, but being back into it now, I remember that like the ability to find a solution is incredibly uh, interesting and fun and hard. It's
and
also
hard.
hard.
Yes. So let's jump. Normally, I ask a little bit about learning points, but I want to ask a lot of that in a little bit of a later section. Let's talk about co-founders a little bit. So you co-founded with one of the people that you functionally co-founded Phoenix Labs with, and it was after this period of reflection and a lot of retrospectives. And so I got to think that there's some part of that was a retrospective of all the different makeups of leadership teams and support structures and everything else of Phoenix Labs. And so at some point on the journey, you and Jesse being like, you know what, it's going to be us two, high five, let's go. And I'm curious how you got there and what were the conversations that mostly drove that, inclusive of it was just everyone else was like, I'm out.
Yes. So my business partner, Jesse, and I've been working together for 16-ish years now. We met at BioWare back when we lived in Alberta. I left BioWare to work at EA Canada. He left BioWare to work at Riot. And when he decided to start Phoenix Labs with Sean and Robin, they had moved back to Vancouver and they recruited me to be their first employee. So we went on that journey together in all of the phases and all of the ups and downs. And when we were sitting and reflecting on it, to your point, there were a lot of different shapes of the company over the years. And the points at which we had felt most effective as a leadership team were when we were a really small company that had a lot of autonomy and a really small leadership group. And it wasn't that I don't love any of the people who were part of our leadership team. And I say this as awkwardly, you were on our leadership team, and I
Mhm.
love our leadership team, and I loved our executives. And it was an incredible group of people, but it was a group of people.
Yeah.
And it's really different to make decisions with two people than it is with eight or 10
Hmm.
or 12.
Hmm.
And when we thought about the problem that we wanted to attack with Critical Path Games, we really wanted to try this crazy invent a new genre and go somewhere that we haven't seen before. And for us to do that, we wanted to limit as much complexity in the other parts of the business so that we could focus on the complexity in the product.
Hmm.
And we have this great dynamic that I like to describe as like our yin yang. On any given spectrum, Jesse and I will exist at different ends of it. And then we find the right balance to solve the problem. And it's been a great setup for us for so long. And it felt natural to continue to do it.
Hmm.
We did have one of the other Phoenix co founders talk with us in the first little bit about joining. Um, and I will say that one of the conversations we had for us as a group was we wrote down sort of a series of questions about our lives, our support structures, our finances, our hours, our interest in travel. And we kind of just went through the journey of like, these are all the things that startup life entail. We each took the questions and went home and we did homework to answer them. And then we came back to talk about our answers. And his answer was, "Oh no, I don't want to do this." And I was so grateful that we were able to have that conversation as friends ahead of the being committed to the
Hmm.
journey, and that he was able to reflect that it wasn't the right moment for him to go back to being in a startup. And for Jesse and I to be able to look at our answers and go, "Oh, no, I actually feel really good about this. I'm ready to sign up for this again."
Yeah. I think that's one of the big things that I took with me out of both Ghostly Bear and, you know, being able to learn from you guys at Phoenix Labs, from where you were at the journey when I joined, of being really thoughtful and reflective going into the startup journey. And so this time, you know, I've made it part of the podcast where I ask some of the co-founder dating questions, but being able, to your point, to like really help folks walk through what is this journey going to be like and are you actually ready for it. And I think that's can be incredibly powerful. Like there absolutely is something to be said for I think I've said it 20 times on this podcast, but the quote, we don't do this because it's easy but because we thought it would be easy, you know, of like going in, charging in full steam ahead. But I think there's also, you know, power in having that self-reflection piece.
Yeah,
um
there's this part of me when I hear founders talking about co-founder dating and looking for a co-founder that sounds just so strange to me. I cannot imagine for myself being ready to sign up on this journey with someone I hadn't already been in the trenches with. And that's an incredible privilege that I get to do it with somebody that I've already been in the trenches with. I know what his stress reactions are. He knows what my stress reactions are. We are very good at calling each other out on our bullshit. We've been in the worst moments with each other and the best moments. And I personally can't imagine trying to build that and build a company at the same time. That just sounds like way too hard for me. I my hats are off to all founders who manage to do that. That seems like extreme level.
Yeah. So let me ask you this because I think you've mentioned it a couple times. In part of the strength of your and Jesse's founding together is you have been through the trenches for a long time. You understand what each other's stress reactions are, um, and you mentioned that part of the great balance that you have found, and part of the way you guys solve problems so effectively, is that you and Jesse will often end up at either side of the spectrum, and then you can very theoretically, rationally, you know, have a dialogue to find where on that spectrum is actually the right point, between you two. I'm curious to go a little, just double click a little bit deeper on that and understand like how do you guys make decisions? How do you guys handle those disagreements of you're on either side of the spectrum? How do you find the right point? Like how does that go?
I think it's a process that we've built and a muscle that we've flexed over time, and it was definitely not as easy when we started as it is now. In the very early days of having some of those hard conversations against like big problems, we would end up going for walks and we would just walk around the block until we came to a conclusion, or our feet got too sore. And there's something about being able to walk next to somebody and you're not sitting staring at each other at a table. You're not staring at each other over Zoom, but you're just both moving and being able to work through the problem that really opened us up to being able to have those long, complicated conversations. And so I know that in a world of remote working, it's not exactly the easiest thing to do, but finding ways to give yourself a big enough space in your calendar that you can follow the conversation where it needs to go instead of feeling like you have to crush it into the 30-minute Zoom window that you set aside for this, I think is really critically important in those early trust building and like the foundational phases of getting to know each other as a leadership team. You know, maybe you can sit side by side on Zoom and have a conversation. Um, and we sort of have this picture of like these parts of the business are primarily his parts of the business and these parts of the business are primarily my parts of the business. And so whenever a question comes up, whichever bucket it falls into, that person gives the like first draft of what the plan is or what the proposal is. The other person gives feedback or counter arguments, and then we just kind of work through it like that. And when something drops into our laps that's completely new and different and it doesn't have an obvious ownership, we sit down and like, how do we want to tackle this problem? Do you want to take this? Do you want me to take this? Should we work on it together? And we do a lot of passing drafts back and forth, whether it's, actual drafts of written communication or just like, I'm thinking about the next step looking like this. Do you want to weigh in before I keep going? Um, Sharing that like early and often has been incredibly helpful for us. I had a manager many years ago who told me that he didn't really mind if I dropped a ball as long as I told him that I was going to drop the ball, that he didn't like being surprised, but he was happy to support if something wasn't going well. And I really took that to heart, and it's something that's really important to me is I don't like being surprised when things aren't going well, and I would much rather be involved in the conversation early enough to at least be prepared for it not going well. And so I've sort of just applied that to the rest of my communication is like, even if it's going well, let's just share updates as soon as possible. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question. It's hard to say how we solve every problem because it's just so in the moment
Yeah,
of
of course.
what is it. But I think it'll at a rough level, that's kind of how we tackle them.
Yeah, and I remember, the sort of practice of the walks and the talking through and the feedback, and that's been consistent between you two. So it makes a ton of sense. Um, Jumping to fundraising, everyone's favorite topic.
Dollar
Having
dollar bills, yo.
exactly. So you went, with Phoenix, you guys were VC funded and then acquired by a public company. And I know from talking to Jesse in the past, that was its own roller coaster ride of emotions and fundraising journey. And he's shared a ton of tips with me over the years that are born from that. When you guys decided to do this whole thing again, how did you think it was gonna sort of play out, and how were you guys prepared to deal with it? And then what sort of surprised you from that journey?
Yeah, I think because the plan was built as a plan to build a business, the financing and how to pay for that was a conversation all the way through it. I wasn't involved in the Phoenix fundraising journey, so I only have the sort of stories of what that first round went like. But I hear when they would talk about it, it was very like, we needed money and we wanted to make a video game, so we talked to some people because Sean used to work as a VC and he knew them. And I don't know that we really understood the implications of being a venture backed company in the same way that we did this time as we considered it. And I don't think that venture is the right support structure for every type of company. I think it really depends on what type of game you want to make, what type of returns you think that that game could have, how big you want to be, how much you want to have a management layer. I think that it's a great system for some types of companies. And I think if you want to make indie or art house style games, it's better to find a publisher. And so when we were talking about what we would want to build again and how we would want to build it, it was really focused on the idea of building a business that was healthy, not a specific game that we wanted to get out of our systems. And so as we talked about it, we spoke to a lot of folks in our network around what the types of options were for financing, what was available in the market, who the good publishers were, who the major players had changed since the last time that we had
Mhm.
been out in the market. And through those conversations, it was a really natural set of decisions to be able to work with some investors that we had known previously. But I think it was only natural because it was part of the conversation from the day we decided to build the studio. Um, So it ended up being a relatively straightforward process for us. In part, that's the second time founder bonus that we got because we had had a successful exit already.
Mhm.
Um, that gives you a leg up into the fundraising world on the second try, and we were really fortunate to be able to take that leg up and have a straightforward fundraising process. Um, but I guess the surprise was, to me, how much less stressful it was than the earlier Phoenix days when we had done the subsequent series is after that first fundraise. Every fundraising round after the initial A was really stressful at
Mhm.
Phoenix. It would derail us for months. Jesse's focus would go off the game and the game would suffer. We would be far behind on paperwork that we needed to get the fundraising done that we didn't know we needed ahead of time. And it would just be this really chaotic moment that would hit us every time we had to fundraise at Phoenix. And so the big surprise for me this time was as second time founders, it didn't feel like that. So that's a nice surprise. But
Mhm.
I don't think typically the surprise that people are getting in the fundraising world right now.
Yeah. No, not at all. But I mean, I do think that, what's important to understand sometimes is that, like, I think for founders of all stripes, it's easy to, when you're thinking, especially on the VC side, I should say, especially on the VC side, which is a lot of where my background comes from too. You look at other studios announcing deals and you're like, they're eye-popping numbers. And what oftentimes you look under the hood, it's exactly what you said. It's the privilege of folks who have founded a company before with a successful exit just get a leg up. Like they're going to attract more funds. And understanding that helps to not compare yourself often along the journey. And I think that I know for me as a founder, especially at Ghostly Bear, that was a big part of it of like, comparison being the thief of joy was a very real part of my life at that point. And so I think recognizing that and you guys at Phoenix earned it. And so like taking advantage of it is great. Um
Yeah. I do think it comes with the interesting new pressure in your life if you understand how the VC system works and if you have learned that, they expect some investments to return enough to offset all of the investments that don't play out, which is super understandable model and it's working great in a lot of places. But when you have that moment where you realize you're the investment that's expected to offset other
mhm.
investments, there's like a deep breath of new pressure that settles into your
Mhm.
chest and stays there for a while like a warm hug.
Yep.
So maybe that was a surprise. I didn't feel that same hug in the first round.
Yep. So I want to switch to uh, where we normally talk about support structures. But I want to take a little bit of a different tack here because, in addition to being a 1.5 times founder and all the work that you do at your own startup, you're also a part of DigiBC, which is uh, I think you guys describe yourselves as a trade group.
It's a nonprofit support group for the interactive digital media industries of British Columbia.
Yes. And
Yes.
you work like I'm deeply sorry. I should have done this research immediately before this. I'm trying to remember your exact title, but you're basically the current head of that organization.
I am the current chair on the board of directors. We have an executive director who runs the business side of the group, who is wonderful and does all of the day to day work. I joined the board of directors for DigiBC back in 2019. Um, and then after a couple of years, I took on a role leading the games group side of the board. We support both video game industry and folks in the film and animation industry. And so we have sort of committees within the group that support those two different aspects of our membership. And so I took on the role supporting the games group side. Um, then I moved into the vice chair role, and then this year I moved into the board chair role. So it is not a I do not do the day-to-day work. That
Yes,
is all
yes,
Locke, and he is wonderful.
yes, yes. No, Locke is wonderful. I appreciate him a great deal. So what I wanted to sort of ask about is like a lot of times in this podcast, I've talked to founders about how they support themselves and what they wish that they had, and like a really ongoing theme has always been and is true for me as well. It's part of why I started the Discord and this podcast is the sense of loneliness and not feeling like you have a lot of folks who really understand the job and the pressures that you're under. And I think we've all sort of tried different ways to either create or seek it out. And so I'm curious to hear more from your perspective as uh from the DigiBC side, where you work with a ton of founders in British Columbia, you work with a ton of companies in British Columbia, and the organization ostensibly is there to support those in many ways. What you sort of see as what an organization like DigiBC or a similar one that may exist in whatever territory a listener is in could be doing, could how they could be involved, and also like what are your big things that you would lay out for people thinking about founding of like you should look for this kind of support.
Yeah, when I was getting started with Phoenix and doing the really nuts and bolts setup around like payroll and benefits and leases and onboarding new employees and what accounting software do you use. Um, the other person who did operational work with me, Sean Bender, was from the US. And so there were a bunch of like it's Canadian system problems that he didn't necessarily have the background for. And I had worked in companies with these systems, but I had never set them up from scratch. And I felt this incredible loneliness, to your point, of like trying to figure out a way through the problem, knowing that there are best practices, knowing that this information should be readily available, and not knowing how to access it. Um, I think about my career as having built it on like these first time problems and just like this one felt like it shouldn't be as hard as it is. And I really wished that I knew someone who was doing this that I could just send them an email and say like, "Hey, what insurance company do you like working with? Do you know a realtor who works in commercial real estate?" And like just the silly little networky parts of that I didn't have. Um, and so when I started to get to know about GBC and the work that they did, it was what really made me interested in joining was this idea that I could take all of this experience that I had just built in getting Phoenix up off the ground and over the last 4 years of launching Dauntless at the time, and then I could start to like share it back into the community. Um, and so that was why I got involved in the organization. At the time, the membership was a lot more medium and big size studios, and so I didn't immediately find that that was a part of the role because EA didn't need me to tell them who my realtor was. They were fine. And there weren't a lot of small studios in Vancouver at that point in time. And so I wasn't sure as I started spending time with them whether this was actually going to scratch that itch for me. And then COVID hit,
Mhm.
and all of a sudden, nobody knew what they were doing, and everybody needed a friend, and everybody was trying to share up to date information and best practices. And the group really suddenly coalesced into this support group of what are you doing? What have you heard? Where did you get hand sanitizer? Like it suddenly just made this
Mhm.
massive shift into we are a community, we're supporting each other because we're all trying to get through something that is really overwhelming us and we none of us know what we're doing. And so not that I would recommend a pandemic as a way to solve any problem. It did have one small silver lining benefit of bringing a bunch of leadership folks in the community together and just getting us talking and getting us in the habit of asking for help which I didn't see us have before. And so coming out of sort of that phase and into the current phase of the Vancouver tech industry and Vancouver games industry, one of the really neat things that we've had is a bunch of really small studios starting up. I mean, you're based here and you've started your group out here, which has been wonderful. And then there's been a bunch of other small studios, 2 people, 5 people, who have been just getting up off the ground. And we've sort of made this little, pseudo incubator for them to be in a space where they have a Discord channel that they can ask each other questions. The GBC gives them space in the office to come in and have lunch together. We find experts for them to talk to. We introduce them to folks in our networks. And they've got this little founders group that they're sort of bouncing ideas off each other. And I'm in this weird moment of both being a founder who's technically in the same group as them and on the board and having done this before. And it's been just the perfect trifecta for me of meeting that opportunity where I feel like I can give back to folks who are at the position I was in
Mhm.
2014 with just the simple questions of like, this is a good accountant who understands how to file for tax credits in Canada. You should talk to them and make it feel like they have a community to call on when they
Mhm.
have questions. I think that the games industry has this like shroud of secrecy that we tend to pull over everything. And I understand why it exists for the IP. I understand why it exists for our products and our technologies. But I think there's this whole part of running businesses and being game developers that does not need to be secret, and that we could build better bridges across studios and groups, because I do think that there's the like rising tide and floating all boats. Like the industry isn't a set number of pieces of pie that we're fighting over. And I think there's space for all of us. And I think that the more successful companies we have, the more successful companies that we get to build. And so I think it's really great to find ways to support people who are earlier in their journey, like you have done with your Discord channel and with the podcast. And like, I'm super excited for those opportunities and like will always try to make time in my schedule to help somebody who's like, how do I fill in the blank? I'm a first time founder.
Mhm. I think what's most interesting to me, and sort of having gone on this journey, of talking and meeting a bunch of founders and getting to know them and trying to pull together a community. I think there's a lot of truth in what you said about sort of the transition of DigiBC is that learning, both sort of having the need, but also just learning how to ask for help. Because I think on the side of the operational stuff and the business and even the fundraising stuff, like the shroud of secrecy isn't real, it's assumed. And it's mostly just people aren't always great at asking for help, because as soon as they do, they get lots of answers. Like people are happy to help because, like, to your point, I think both you and I are like, "Oh my god, please let you're going through this, I've been through that. Please let me help you," right? Um and so I think, as I'm curious if you have any thoughts or any suggestions for listeners of like how to think about or how to encourage them to ask for help or get over that hump of like, because I think if folks just ask, they will often find answers, but then yet somehow people still don't.
Yeah, the most effective way I have ever found to get people to ask for help is to show them myself asking for help, or to talk openly about the things I didn't know, or talk about being faced with a problem that I didn't understand and how I got there. I don't know if it's just a inherent human quality of like not wanting to show weakness, but there's this like big, scary, if I admit I don't know what I'm doing, then people won't respect me. And like the big secret is none of us know what we're doing. And I think the more open we are about that and make it normal to not know and say like, I actually don't know. Let me go find out, I think is one of the most powerful sentences ever. And I try really hard to model that behavior in my life because I spent the early parts of my career being terrified that people were going to find out I didn't know what I was talking about. And now I just tell them I don't know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. So switching back a little bit to more of your journey on the game side, game studio side specifically. Um, you've come through, you've gotten the studio up and running. You built the business, you solved all these problems because you've seen them all before, and you know the accountants, you have them on speed dial. You've renovated a garage, and now you work with four of Jesse's wonderful cars all the time, as well as other delightful humans. Uh, what is on the horizon for both yourself and the company that you're thinking along?
Well, I think we're going to make a video game. I was thinking that's probably
Maybe.
a good plan for us. No, uh, we're at this really awesome moment where we've picked a project that we want to move into development after going through a really in-depth prototyping phase. For the first 9 months of the company, we just did a whole bunch of prototypes in a row with really interesting new core loops and gameplay features, and we just tried to do them as quickly as possible in Unreal and not talk too much about like what the game could be around that, but like let's just see if this one thing is fun and if we like it. um and we found one that we're really excited about, and so we're moving that towards developing a vertical slice. And it's been interesting because suddenly we have to sort of like slow down and write a lot of documentation instead of just building things every day, which is a bit of a shift. But it's really exciting to be at that phase of development again, where you're talking about potential and you're talking about sort of the big wrappers and the minute details, and everything is an ocean of possibility. So I think we're going to spend most of the next 12 months getting that ready to go and getting it into testing and making sure that players resonate with it as much as we do. Um, and I think over that course of time, I'm going to find a whole bunch of new parts of the operations and the business that I haven't done as much as before. We are very small. There are only 7 of us, and we're heavily on the engineering side. So there's an artist and myself who are not engineers. And sometimes we just laugh when they laugh so that they think that we know what they're talking about. And I'm going to spend a bunch of the next year figuring out how to better support them from a production standpoint. And how are we going to? We've got, light production practices in place right now, but we are going to need to start to scale those up. And that's not something I've had to do before. So I'm going to read some books and do some Googling and figure out how to do that.
Excellent. And now let me cap off the main part of the interview with the incredibly unfair question that I like to throw everyone's way, which is, given the experience thus far, and you've had, 1.5 founding journeys, as we've been saying, in the future, sort of regardless of which way the wind blows on Crit Path, do you think you'd start another company? Are you a serial entrepreneur?
I mean, it depends is a terrible answer, but it depends. I think if it was to solve a problem that I was excited about, or to work with people that I love working with, for sure. I don't think I'm the type of serial entrepreneur who's like, I have a laundry list of business ideas in my back pocket, but I love group projects, and I like working with people to solve
Mhm.
interesting problems. And so if that presented itself again, I can't imagine I'd say no to it. But it's not like I'm taking notes and planning for what the next thing looks like.
Yeah. The only business you're taking notes about and planning for the future is the bookshop that you'll open, where you don't have to talk to anyone.
Yes, it also has a side portion of that bookshop where I have baby hedgehogs. And I do have extensive notes about that business plan tucked away for the future. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. So To cap off the podcast, I always ask guests a series of sort of introspection lightning round questions. These are based on how I did. I think we talked about this a little bit earlier in the conversation about how I did co-founder dating and sort of helping to understand uh, the basis by which we would work as a founding team and that kind of stuff. And so I like to ask these questions just because they're fun to put you on the spot. So I always start out with, what is your superpower?
I think that I describe it as like I can hold a lot of open tabs in my brain. I can keep them all active in RAM at one time. And it's really easy for me to switch back and forth between tasks and conversations quickly without losing the flow of any of them. Um, this is a superpower in that I get to remember things and be able to do a lot of things and stay on top of them. It does drive a lot of people in my life crazy because I will flip tabs in the middle of a conversation and they're like, "What? We were talking about this other thing." And I was like, "Well, yes, but I'm done." And I moved to the next thing. But then I go back to that tab and they're like, "I cannot switch this much." So I would describe it as a strong ability to multitask effectively. But, the accepted science is that multitasking isn't technically possible. So I would say I can flip tabs really fast in my brain without losing track of what I'm doing. That's my superpower.
Excellent. And outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
That's a good question. Um, not knowing what I'm doing. I say that, but like my entire career in games has been built on somebody saying to me, "This is a problem and somebody needs to figure it out." And then I've figured it out. I have done well with working through a problem on the first time and figuring out how to figure out a problem. Um, it started with how do I build finance systems across BioWare and EA after that acquisition without a finance team. And every step has just been what's the next biggest problem that's in front of us? Oh, it's player support for Dauntless. We don't have a player support person. Guess I'm going to figure out what that looks like, and not letting that phase me. I think I think in part that comes from an entire childhood in theater and improv. I spent a very large amount of my life learning how to roll with live theater punches and how to respond when somebody doesn't know their lines. And so using those improv skills in business, I think is a secret life hack that more people should know about. Take an improv class; it's good for you.
Excellent. My co-founder, who is also a big improv and theater nerd, approves of this message. What are your big weaknesses?
Oh, well, going back to the lots of tabs in my brain, I do tend to forget to update people when I've made changes to the plan in my head. Um, it has been a regular source of feedback from folks in my life that they're frustrated that I haven't done something or that I haven't made progress on something. And I just didn't tell them that. So that is not my strongest suit for sure. I think the thing that actually gets the most in my way to this day, and is something that I have had to work really hard to figure out how to work with myself on, is that I have an extremely hard time giving feedback on written content, especially like docs or slides, if the formatting isn't consistent. And so like I get really distracted by trying to fix layout or grammar or spelling, and I completely lose focus on the content or whether the overall message is actually good. And so over the years, I have had to bring practices into my life, like writing first drafts in Notepad where there are no formatting options, so I can't think about it, and working really hard to center the content over what it looks like is a endless source of difficulty in my life.
Excellent. Remind me to continue to not show you any of my PowerPoints in progress.
I have a system. There's a lot of labels. I make notes about what text size on each slide. It's a thing.
Yep. What are your stress reactions?
Oh, yeah. I call it the need to build a desk problem. I want something that has a checkbox or like a really hands-on physical, like I can do something and there's a finished state and there's a completionist dopamine hit that comes. And when I'm like super stressed with a problem or facing this like big unknowable problem, uh, I have to fight the urge to like go pick up something that's low priority or low urgency because it's really knowable and I could just check the list and it would feel really good. So I have over time tried to build that stress reaction into finding video games that feel like check boxes, and then I can get the dopamine hit from the checkbox and then go do the annoying problem that's really frustrating me. So, um, yeah, I like to, just build a desk when I'm stressed. Just get your hands dirty and build a desk.
I'd like to believe that the unit next to your unit is just an office supply store that you've assembled all their furniture for them.
Yeah, it's just a warehouse full of desks over here. That's what I got.
Excellent. And what are your upkeep needs?
Um,
And you've started playing Magic, so you know what upkeep is now.
I have started playing Magic. I've fallen into the trap. I'm currently sitting, you can't tell this because it's a podcast, but I am currently sitting surrounded by literally boxes of Magic cards because my current stress reaction is sorting them and alphabetizing them and making it all clean and neat and tidy. And it's been incredibly comforting. I need, what do I need? I try not to think about that question very much. I try to just put one foot down in front of the other. I need coffee in the morning and I need to read a book at the end of the day. And between that, I try to be as flexible as possible because that's kind of how my life is organized. Reading is really important to me. I read a lot of stupid fluff. I call it like cotton candy for my brain. And I love cotton candy for my brain TV, where it's like, it doesn't ask anything of me. It doesn't tax my emotions. It just lets me be a puddle for a little bit. And having reading at the end of every day has been really good for my mental health. Having eating food away from my desk has been a new different thing that I'm trying this year, and I feel like it's been really positive for me. But in general, I try to just go with the flow as much as possible.
Yeah.
That's not a very good answer, but I'm not very good at upkeep, honestly.
I mean, what I like about your answer to some degree is it started with read a book at the end of every day. And in my mind, knowing you for many years and exactly how much you read and the list of reads, I'm like, oh no, she doesn't mean read a portion of a book at the end of the day. She means literally cover to cover at the end of a day. She's going to somehow finish a book.
That rarely happens. It takes me at least 2 or 3 days to read a book.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time.
Most of the time. Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me, Jen. As always, I deeply enjoy hanging out with you and getting to have other people learn about how awesome you are and your journey so far. Is there anything you'd like to share or shout out or call out here at the end of the pod for our listeners?
If you're choosing to go on this crazy founding journey thing, all the power to you. It's wild over in this part of the woods, and but there are a lot of us, and it's okay to ask for help. We might not know the exact path that you are going on, but we are familiar with the forest, and that's about as far as I can make that metaphor go. So ask for help. It's okay. We don't bite.
Excellent. And then if someone was listening to this podcast and really enjoyed an answer or wanted to, as you said, ask for help from you specifically, is there a best way to get in touch with you?
LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to find me. My name is very unique, and there are no other ones on LinkedIn. You will find me immediately. I just ask that you maybe put a note in the request that tells me that you're not trying to sell me your art and or engineering and or B2B sales process services, because those I am less excited about.
Yes. And as soon as, one thing I will say for those who have not yet gone on the founding journey, who are considering going on the founding journey, as soon as you go on that founding journey, your LinkedIn requests will be filled with B2B sales opportunities. And so adding notes and saying who you are and why you're connecting is pretty much the only way to break through the noise. So thank you so much again. As always, it's a pleasure to hang out with you. And thanks for joining my podcast.
Well, thanks for doing this, Carl. I think it's really nice that you're giving people an opportunity to hear why they shouldn't found a company.
Yes, that is probably the takeaway for some people.
Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano, music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work in games. And if you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounders.org or email me at carl@gamefounders.org. Thanks so much.